This is the webinar format, so welcome to everybody. We're currently 30 people at this webinar. I'm James Candon, Managing Director of United Europe, so thank you everybody for joining us this evening. We have more or less started punctually, and we intend to finish punctually to allow our guests who have so kindly offered up their time to get on with their busy schedules. For attendees who are new and not familiar with United Europe, we are a non-profit organization with the primary goal of promoting three things: the diversity, unity and competitiveness of Europe. Everything we do stems from including this event tonight. If you're interested in our associate or work and participate in future events, you may do so by visiting our website, for which will be posted in the chat of this webinar later on. By the way, there's a special rate for students as of today. I have to confess, are tonight, given that we have three white men as our participants, but please note that they are in fact from diverse parts of Europe, such as Denmark, Slovakia, Greece. We actually aim to host a French language and German language version of this very same debate in the near future. So if you know of any qualified speakers or moderators in those languages, please do let us know. So to briefly introduce our guest tonight, we have as our moderator, Professor Jacobides, the Sir Donald Gordon Professor of Entrepreneurship and Innovation and Professor of Strategy at school. He's the advisor of Evolution Limited, an academic advisor to BCG and the Chief Digital Economy Expert, Hellenic Competition Commission. He is the co-author of the WEF white paper on digital platforms and ecosystems. Also, we have all the way from Silicon Valley right now is Chris, founder and CEO of Tradeshift, a global cloud network and platform for commerce between companies serving more than 1 million businesses. And last but not least is Mr. Martin Bruncko, the founder and managing director of Steam Capital and a member of the investment committee of the European Innovation Council. He was previously head of Europe at the World Economic Forum, innovation minister of Slovakia, and deputy for European affairs of the finance ministry of Slovakia. So before I hand over to our moderator, a final word on the proceedings for this evening's event. It will continue for as long as, the debate will continue for as long as Professor Jacobides deems useful, at which time he may take questions which you, the audience, will hopefully have submitted over the chat function of this webinar. There will be an opportunity to vote in a poll or two in order to get a sense of the overall views of you, the audience. And of course, the goal tonight is for an and entertaining debate. So please enjoy the evening. Over to you, Professor.
Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be with you and to be speaking about something that is, even in this interesting and unusual period of ours, quite hot on the agenda. And it is hard not only because we're starting to regulate big tech, but also because we're feeling the impact of big tech everywhere. In a week that the President of the United States found himself weakened, not because he was impeached, not because he potentially could be thrown out of office, but because he did not have any access to Twitter, and because unilaterally particular firms substituting for the state decided that his new chosen platform should not go and be available through their own privately and fully independently decided app store functions. We are now seeing that big tech has a heck of a lot of power. Now, it does not only have power over speech and democracy, which is clearly, given all these bizarre shenanigans happening on the other side of the Atlantic, things that we are watching very carefully, although these are certainly going to come home to roost, especially in the United States. We're speaking about the regulation that has to do with big tech, because big tech has grown so large that it cannot and actually should not be ignored. Not only is it the majority of big indices like the S&P 500, which we will say is the S&P 5. It's just the big 5 companies that really comprise of this index. It is also that a number of business activities that used to be done in traditional sectors are now done by big tech that has organized and orchestrated ecosystems, and that these ecosystems have powers that are really extreme. When you see the lawsuits in one side of the Atlantic, companies like Fortnite that are suing Apple or other friends of theirs like Match.com and Tinder, saying we are really pushed by these big giants. Or if you read the decisions, or rather the rationalization for the lawsuits against Google and Facebook, you understand that there is quite a bit of power. Now, the question is, what should we do with power? It's clear that it exists. It's clear that this power is power not only over you and me and the way in which we interact and engage with the world, it's also power vis-a-vis any other complementer. It's the power that Booking.com and Airbnb has over the people that are trying to see if they can use their auntie's house that is being rented out in the summer. It is the power that may be wielded against much bigger entities that, again, find themselves needing to adjust to what big tech firms say, well, it's just the market and you should let the market go. And of course, you're going to have all kinds of rather silly theological debates. And I expect we're going to hear a bit of silliness tonight, as we do in most debates. No disrespect intended. We're going to see extreme views, or I certainly hope we are, and I'm going to cede more extremity, if not, so that we don't get bored in yet another Zoom-based discussion tonight. Now, we have two worthy opponents who are going to be speaking about regulation, which is particularly important for Europe, because for a change, Europe is in the technological forefront. Sadly, it is not in the technological forefront of having great technological companies. It's in the technological forefront of having great regulation. Now, one might say that it would be nice if Europe also had the big tech firms, but what it does have is cutting-edge regulation. Perhaps it has cutting-edge regulation because it doesn't have any of these big platform firms that are regulated. Perhaps it's just that we kind of know what happens when there are big and powerful data mining institutions that take advantage of people. Now, to illuminate that, we're going to have a debate between Martin Bruncko and Christian Lanng. I will have to say, and for those of you who are curious to see part of the biases, that I had worked, need to have my conflicts of interest aired, worked with Martin, and if you go to www.evolutionlimited.net, you will see a report that we did trying to decode all of these big regulations. The EU announced them on December the 15th, the Digital Services Act and the Digital Market Act. But what that means, we will leave to our participants. So let me start with opening statements. And as I mentioned that I have worked with Martin, let me start with Christian. Christian, what do you make of Europe's advance?
So first off, thank you for that very unbiased introduction and setup on the advantage/disadvantages of big tech. It's very clear that you are lining up a choice, but I think the choice is sort of false. We're not having a choice between big tech and no tech, or big tech and small tech. We are having a choice between big tech and or old European incumbents. And I think that's what we got to remember every single time we have this discussion about the big American tech companies. In most European countries, in fact, in all of them pretty much, top 5 listed companies, I just took Germany, UK, and France, and the average age for top 5 listed companies is 100 years. It is these incumbents that most politicians who talk about big tech are out to protect. And they wouldn't have lasted 100 years if Europe did not have a long and proud tradition for protectionism. And I think the choice is also not just against versus big tech versus small tech, because all European leaders, they talk about how much they love startups, how much they love innovation, how much they want to build new companies. But the reality is that all of this regulation that is meant to essentially be trade policy by another name, because Europe don't have any big tech giants, we try to tax the American ones by the back door. It's sort of backfiring in the sense that it's generating massive obstacles for European startups. And I mean, I'll just give you a few examples. Most recently, Schrems 2, which is a piece, it's a judgment where a European court found that essentially ripped up the Privacy Shield trade agreement with the US and said that's not applicable anymore because we find that the US don't have adequate privacy protections. The court said at the same breath that it cannot enforce that against European countries. So they can hold countries outside Europe to this standard and say that European companies or anybody in Europe cannot share data with any country that don't hold these standards high enough. But it cannot, for instance, tell Poland or Romania or Denmark to enforce this. The real consequence of that is that one of our German customers cannot send me a spreadsheet with a list of their suppliers and the suppliers' company emails, not their personal emails, because in Europe we consider company emails PII. This is essentially actually harsher regulation than we have between China and the rest of the world. And the reason we can't do that is because we use the Google Cloud services, and that's a US service provider, so we cannot email European PII on any US service according to the Schrems regulation. So I think the hypocrisy here is obviously that Europe is not even holding its own member countries to the same standards that is now holding the outside world, which very clearly also shows this is sort of trade policy by another name. So I just want to underline that will be my starting position, probably my position through all of this. This is not about big tech versus small tech. This is about big tech versus old incumbents. And if Europe was truly interested in startups, innovation, and tech, we would have just one stock exchange in Europe with a tech company in top 5. But we don't, because nobody's interested in that. They're interested in the idea of big tech. They're interested in idea of innovation, not really innovation.
Right. Well, I'm going to take Chairman's prerogative to say that part of that is, of course, we are clearly not interested in solving all of Europe's problems. We're interested about tech regulation. So moving a bit closer to tech regulation, and before I allow Martin to challenge that, and given that the only rules that I have agreed to abide by are the Geneva Convention, very elementary, rudimentary rules, I will say, interesting, Christian, you didn't tell us much about regulation. You tell us about your gripes about Europe, and we can add a few more. What about?
I didn't mention Schrems. I think that's a really good example. I don't know how to pronounce it, but we can go into more regulation if you want. We have the new industrial cloud framework that is saying how we should build clouds. And of course, it says it's only industrial clouds at the moment, but the regulation very clearly aim at being all cloud. And of course, it's connected, right? We're not just talking European regulation. We're talking European innovation. And because we're talking about regulating big tech because there are no tech companies of scale in Europe. And that's the reason we're having the debate, and that's why the regulation exists. And saying we should just discuss the regulation in a vacuum without discussing why we are even having this regulation or what the context of it is absurd. It's like discussing regulation for pollution without talking about where pollution comes from or why.
Right. Well, Martin, it seems from listening to Christian that he does not engage much with Apple, Google, Facebook, Twitter, and the like, and does not feel any of the power. What are your views about their power and Europe's effort to try to curb them? Because regulation seems to be rather directed, and perhaps directed not only to big firms, but as I understand from Christian, if I understood it right, to big firms and small firms. What's your take?
So I think the real issue here on the table is what is the European action and regulation, but also non-regulatory action against big tech. I think this is the problem. Now, making it sound like this is sort of Europe is doing it uniquely on its own, and it's only doing it to protect its old incumbent industry. Well, first of all, it's not quite true, because this is not just happening in Europe. Actually, if you look at what's happening in the United States is also launching increasing action against big tech. And if you look at just Google, so Google is currently facing 3 types of anti-monopoly action from the Justice Department. So clearly there's a recognition now, not just in Europe, but also in the US, that there is an issue, that there is a problem in the US with the big tech as well. Now, the gist of the regulation that's actually being put in place right now is, in a way, a kind of an anti-monopoly action by another name, or sort of a different complementary version of anti-monopoly action. And I think all of us here can agree, and even neoclassical economists, and I have to say, I've been trained as a neoclassical economist in the United States. So even in the United States, even at those liberal universities, the economists believe that if you get a monopoly, that's actually a bad thing, that ultimately the consumers suffer. Now, the problem with anti-monopoly action is that typically, and the classical economics will tell you that the problem with monopoly is that it leads towards much higher prices. But however, we are here dealing with a unique market where a lot of the products are provided, quote unquote, for free. So there is no price to the market. And the real price that the consumer pay, it's their data, it's their attention. And ultimately, it's them becoming commodity for marketing and advertising purposes. So what Europe has been trying to do is basically trying to come to task with the fact that we're here in a new situation where we're dealing with products that we're no longer looking at prices is basically the right, and dealing with negative effects of monopolies. And again, what Europe is really trying to do is it is being a step ahead of the US in terms of bringing in more effective, more efficient way of ensuring that companies do not become abusive monopolies, and those that have already become abusive monopolies, and they are based to the extent that they are inhibiting any kind of competition, serious competition in the market, that this will no longer be happening. And maybe final point on this one is that, and the reason why Europe is actually going in this direction is because the traditional anti-monopoly action no longer works. Because traditionally an anti-monopoly action would be that, well, if we think that this company has become too big, it's too monopolistic, it's abusing its position, well, we go through a lawsuit and we fix the situation. The problem is that these lawsuits now last easily 3, 5, 7 years. And as Christian knows very well, 3, 5, 7 months, let alone 3, 5, 7 years in the digital domain, given the competition there, that's basically light years. It's eons. So this is a no way to deal with these companies, because by the time you're done with the lawsuit, the companies that have been basically, they were being killed, actually do become killed by these monopolies.
Well, and I would just take German's prerogative to say that's not even the biggest problem. As someone who works exactly on this area, the biggest problem is that the existing frame does not even capture the power of platforms and ecosystems, because we don't have the right analytical tools. And what the Europeans are trying, and actually what the Americans are starting to try as well, is to see how they can reform to change that. So Christian, I heard you earlier on to have gripes about Europe. As a Greek who has also a British passport, I can tell you that gripes about Europe are cheap, and they don't always lead you to the good place. So only slightly more seriously, can we move beyond the gripes against Europe and what we should be doing to look at the regulation itself? I appreciate that there are other things that you would like to see happening, but what about the things that are happening? What about?
No, I think, we cannot. So first off, I think it's fair, right? Two academics versus one founder. I think that's roughly the quota you should strive for at any given point. No. Sorry,
I have to correct you.
Yeah.
So it's one academic, and it's basically two founders, but one, much more.
Okay. So obviously, I see what you want to do, which is you want to discuss just the merits of regulation in a vacuum without any of the outcomes or purposes or anything attached to that. So I don't know how to evaluate.
We'll go there. I just don't.
I don't know how to evaluate regulation without thinking about what should be the outcome. Yeah.
Your past is a politician that comes up. I'm speaking
just
about the evasion of the question. I'm not speaking about
no. So we should dive a little bit into the question, right? So the challenge is Europe essentially is not generating regulation to try to manage these big tech companies. They're creating regulation to at this point now keep them out, right? I mean, it's at the same breath as we have new cloud regulation that we're announcing a Gaia X consortium with a very explicit purpose, backed by German and French government, to replace Amazon in Europe. I mean, that's literally part of the speeches the politicians are making as they're announcing Gaia X, connected to new industry cloud initiatives from the European Union, connected to regulation of big tech and how we can share data within Europe. I mean, it's mentioned in one breath that we want to have our own cloud industry, and at the same time we say that the US big tech is bad and we want to regulate how they share data. And to take that extreme, and you don't want to accept that, right? But who are the partners in the Gaia-X consortium? Well, that is BMW, Deutsche Telekom, it is France Telecom, Orange, and so on. It's the old big incumbents. So we are creating protective regulation to protect the incumbents so they can get the market share that they're afraid they're losing to the Americans. Now, as for the actual monopoly, I think it's very, very, convenient to sort of say the old definition of monopolies don't work, so we need to change this because they're giving the services away for free. The reality is actually Amazon has lost market share during COVID in the US to physical retailers because physical retailers have had to innovate. And they now have curbside pickup, they have better e-commerce solutions, and they're actually innovating rapidly. So Amazon has lost market share in retail in the US. So what we forget about these so-called monopolies is how quick they're over. Who remember Yahoo, who remember American Online, who remember any of these? At any given point. And what's interesting about tech is our old school monopoly laws, and what Martin is referring to, is thinking about competition within a domain. But in tech, it is always another domain that killed the previous one. It is not that Amazon is going to be beat by Walmart or another Amazon. They're going to be beat by somebody who invent a whole different way of shopping. And that's why most of the monopoly law is not really relevant. And that's actually why most of the US monopoly lawsuits are in big trouble, because they cannot point to how, for instance, Google has prevented Amazon from growing, or Facebook, and all of these. And they're replacing each other by going into different industries and completely negating the need for the previous generation. So I have two issues, and it's not a gripe about Europe, but I have two issues. One is there's a lot of politicians that are getting a lot of credit in Financial Times and everywhere else about the regulation they're enacting and the fight against big tech, when in reality it's trade policy by another name, and it has the direct outcome of protecting big European incumbents. And I just think European citizens should know, and people who want to start European startups. I mean, can you imagine the disadvantage you're going to be at in the future if you want to build a startup in Europe and you're forced to use Gaia-X built by our friendly industrials with a budget of $2 billion a year, when Amazon, they spend $23 billion a year in R&D. I mean, it's going to be like Minitel, but instead of just being France who's fucked, it's going to be all of Europe. And so I'm actually speaking as a European here. I think, the idea that we can regulate and then demand we build our own platforms, our own tech, we're not good enough to do it. We are hardly good enough to write the regulation where we understand what this is about. I mean, Gdpr is a complete mess. Nobody who have any technical insight whatsoever has been involved at any point writing Gdpr. And I can tell you, because the loopholes are this big, and the stuff that they are trying to regulate is so small.
Good. We'll need to stop it there, because you have thrown in about, I was counting 6 or 7 different things, and I suspect that Martin will want to address things anywhere from, the old chestnut of industrial policy versus competition policy to the who medax exactly are these policies hurting, to the, these poor monopolies are not monopolies because they can be pushed out by other monopolies. Don't you see that it's a very competitive market? To the, it's not really a market because in tech, it's competition domain, so things are more fluid. To the regulators, after all, can't be intelligent. What they do is clumsy and follows reality with a particularly great lag. So Martin, a lot to pick from there. What would you like to focus on?
Well, a number of things. So first of all, Christian is making it sound like as if the goal of the European politicians was to try to create European competitiveness and European champions, basically by just trying to destroy and attack the successful US big tech, and somehow by that create space for the large industrial European companies to step into that space that have been just now vacated by the big tech. And that's clearly not the case. And clearly, I don't think anybody in their right mind in the European Commission, in the national capitals, believes that the way for Europe to become competitive is simply and only by attacking the large big tech. clearly the way is to create conditions for startups in Europe to emerge. Now, the problem, however, with startups who then become scale ups and who eventually start dominating these markets. Now, the problem that Europe has here, we have to recognize it, that tech ecosystems, they're like forests. They take a while to grow. And even in Silicon Valley, Silicon Valley is the best tech ecosystem in the world for many reasons. But one of them is that it actually is also the oldest, arguably, deep tech ecosystem in the world. And it's been very well documented by studies, for example, by Endeavor, which have shown that the key driver of a successful tech and startup ecosystem is one large major success story. So it's a company that becomes really big, and then others can start growing out of it. And this is where Europe is clearly at a disadvantage, just historically it is. And now, and actually prove that this is how things work are, look at countries like Estonia. I mean, this is a country that managed to create one very large unicorn very early on in this domain. And that has basically then led to many other very successful companies, including a number of unicorns emerging there, started by people who used to be early employees in Skype or investors, and then who go and come and return back to the ecosystem. Now, the problem with the big tech is that markets, academics would say, sometimes markets have a tendency to tip. They become so, some of the companies can become so big that they literally start being ruled by one company only. And no matter what the emerging competitors do, they simply cannot compete just because of the abusive power of these monopolies. And this is why we have had historically an action against monopolies, whether it was against major oil companies beginning of the century, or AT&T. So kind of believing that sort of market will take care of things. Market usually does take care of things, but there are such things as market failures. So again, the problem is that some of these companies, like Google, like Facebook, they have become, they've now reached the tipping point, past the tipping point where they're tipping the market and are, becoming really abusive. And even if there is a competitor that emerges, they have now amassed so much power that simply it's impossible for, no matter how good you are, to compete. And I think one good example of that is that, the first anti-monopoly actions against Apple in Europe it's not from the big old companies or from governments. It's actually from Spotify, arguably a leading company that actually created its own market. The problem is, of course, that companies like Facebook, Google, Apple, what they do is they are taking advantage of the data they have collected on their users and other resources to then go into adjacent markets and effectively unfairly try to compete in that market and push out even the successful startups, whether they're European or not, out of that market. And that's what basically Google, so for example, Apple has been doing with Apple Music, where they clearly try to put at a disadvantage companies like Spotify because of benefits that they have reached, like, for example, their gatekeeper access, i.e., if you really want to be using an app on your iPhone, Apple, you have to go through a store which is controlled by Apple. And then Apple has been doing all kinds of things to really put the competitors at a disadvantage compared to their own services. So let me just pause here, just to be fair to it.
And at least here we had something which delved a little bit more deeply in one of the points that, Christian, you made. Problem? I see no problem. These guys are not really doing anything unfair. You also said a couple of things that, as far as I'm concerned, fly against the data that I'm aware of. You said these guys compete against each other. The answer, certainly for GAFA, is no, they don't. They do very marginally. As a matter of fact, Google bribes Apple with 12 billion, let me repeat that, billion in order for Apple not to engage in search and to allow Google to do all the dirty work of finding all the data that consumers have, sell it on either directly or through its own ad tech stack, which it has dominating the market. There's a separate lawsuit against that and against the fact that no, it cannot be pushed off. And one of the concerns that the Europeans have brought up is you can't be both an arbiter and a player there. So it seems to be a very courageous man who would say there is no problem. I hope you're going to at least partly couch that, not quite in a Trumpian fashion.
We need to stop Michael here because it's going to look like we have colluded against you. And
that's fine. I mean, that's.
We never did
start pushing on you, Martin, but I would like you to be
So I think it's a great point. I mean, thank you for bringing it up, right? So first off, they're very much competing. I mean, don't be so naive. You don't think that you understand what Apple's privacy shield means. Like Apple has more encryption, more hidden privacy fields. They just nuked ads in their browsers on their phones. They know exactly how to attack Google, and it's not by going into search. I mean, they're not morons. I mean, like Microsoft, who tried to take.
No, they're not. But all I'm saying is they are colluding.
So the point is just they know how to listen. This is advanced warfare. They know how to strangle Google's revenue stream by pushing privacy. That's exactly what's happening. The market is actually taking care of what you're saying it's not. Apple has very clearly taken the position we are pro-privacy in every single way we can. They're making it part of the product everywhere they advertise. Now, back to the Estonia point, just to briefly mention that, I think there's a lot of discussions on Skype where it comes from: Danish, Swedish, Estonian. I think the developers were from Estonia, so let's just give it to Estonia. The 4 largest companies in Estonia is 3 banks and an energy company. But I get your point. They got bought by an American company, by the way, and probably wouldn't have grown as big as they were if they hadn't. But I think just to take that point on the Apple and the Apple Store, because I think that was your main sort of trust on all of this. And I'm not saying everything is perfect. I'm just saying that regulation do more damage than good when it's trying to regulate this, because it clearly don't understand what's going on.
Do we have a problem? I still don't have a straight answer. But we don't have a problem, do we, or do we not?
We have problems, but we don't have problems in the scale of, let's say, oil companies, getting subsidies in the hundreds of billions, destroying the planet. And I think that's always the context. You got to look at shit. So, but anyways, and they have absolute monopolies. Come on. But
companies in technology.
No. I mean, it's just like we cannot compare to other industries when we talk monopolies, apparently. But like, I want to get to the App Store example, because that was at the trust of Martin's point, right? So first off, the App Store has generated $274 billion of developer revenue over the last few years. They created a market. This is not a matter of them taking a market and fairly holding it. No, they invented a market that was not there before. Now you talk about them positioning their own products within that market. Have you ever gone to a Tesco? Have you noticed where their own private label products sit? If you ever go to a Walmart, notice where their private label, everybody do this in retail. And they also do this in old school retail. Do you think Tesco don't use data on what kind of butter you buy when they create their own private label for their butter? Of course they do. So what you generally have a problem with is called market research. They own the store, just like Tesco owned the store, just like Walmart owned the store. And they're using the traffic, the foot traffic in their store to decide what products they want to launch.
But Christian, the big difference here is that retail is a competitive market. So, this is not a highly concentrated monopoly or oligopolistic market where you have one player, right? So now this is the issue. But if you look at, for example, the mobile operating systems, this is effectively a duopoly. It's Apple and it's Google. So
Android is open source, and Xiaomi, which by the way is one of the biggest phones, is growing faster than Apple is in Asia.
No, but Google is Android is open source, but you cannot really use Android if you're a phone manufacturer unless you're also using Google mobile services, which is
that's actually not true. I mean, if you have a Xiaomi phone, you have it without Google services, and you can get a Play Store from Xiaomi, and it's growing, as I said again, faster than Google and Apple in Asia.
Christian, there's a difference between the App Store, and indeed there are multiple app stores for.
I understand exactly how it works. I have a Xiaomi phone
in China,
exactly, and you can easily run a Xiaomi phone without any of the Google services. But it's again, I'm not saying that it's not a problem that Google and Apple have big positions. I see that, but I'm just saying, the way that we think about regulating these problems, and at the same time we don't apply it anywhere else, is very, very selective. So and it's very protected. It ends up being protectionist by another name.
So going back to the, sorry, I can't help it on Android. I mean, if it were the case that you could actually run an Android without GMS very easily, then why would be Huawei developing their own operating system? And in fact, Huawei is actually also a very good example, because it kind of sees, sometimes you sound like you believe that the US, Europe is the only one that's really attacking big tech when they feel that they're at a disadvantage. Look at what the US has done with Huawei, right? And people who really understand that, obviously, by the way, Huawei are they're no saints. And we all know that there's probably been a lot of trade secrets theft, over the decades. But when it became clear that Huawei is now, outcompeting Cisco and become the most competitive company in the world, US went way far beyond what Europe has done with regulation, where they openly and directly said, look, actually, Huawei, you can no longer do business in the US. And which is, and they were, because all the companies were cut off from American companies from working with Huawei, including Google, Huawei is basically now no longer able to use GMS in Android. And it was such a big problem for them that they in the end decided that the only way for us to survive on the handset business, not obviously on the infrastructure business.
But that's a very simple answer to that. Xiaomi, they spent 10 years building their own version of those services. Huawei did not, and then when they got cut access, they had a problem. I mean, I don't think IP should be free. I don't think. I mean, if you don't invest in R&D, you cannot expect to just catch up magically.
Of course.
And I mean, the reality is,
I will have to, as a chairman's role, I will have to ensure that we have some consistency in the argument. I think that here the question is it possible to seamlessly integrate? And as an academic, I'll say you have a great national experiment. You have a firm that loved working with Android and was then forced out of. And then they said, holy cow, what will I do? And begrudgingly, because initially they said, could you please allow us to play? And then Trump said, no, I don't like you because you're becoming too strong. And then they said, we'd still like to play. And then he says, no, not even in direct foundry allowances. Then it goes.
But how can you make that example how can you make this example and conveniently forget that 30 years ago, the world's largest phone company was called Nokia and sat in Finland?
No, I don't forget it conveniently at all. I just think it is irrelevant because we're not speaking about the example that I had. It's not a convenient thing switching examples, but we're not going to have an argument. What I want to see is answers to a couple of questions that have remained unaddressed. If I hear you right, Christian, you're saying a couple of things. Actually, one is, to me, sounds a little different now because you're like, perhaps there is a problem. Not quite, there isn't a problem, but Europe is not regulating it right. Do you think US is regulating it right? Or do you think that the people who are suggesting about regulation, possibly along the example of what Europeans are doing, are misguided because they're not going to get it right?
Yeah, I mean, first off, I think, a lot of the privacy discussion is completely misguided, right? I mean, just to take that one slice, all European countries are going hard in on privacy. At the same time, there's more surveillance of the internet in Europe than anywhere else in the world except for China. So what they're really saying is they want a state monopoly on surveillance. I think if you just look at the specifics, right? So I'll take Schrems 2, and I don't know if you followed that court case, but there was a European judge that unilaterally said you cannot store PII on American IT services because they do not live up to our privacy standards. He ripped up like 5 different trade agreements between the US and EU doing that. And the consequence is actually, if I have to follow that law, no European startup can store any kind of PII on any kind of American IT service. That is absolutely extreme. I mean, just as an example of regulation, that is extreme.
It's interesting, but irrelevant to the question that I asked. The question that I asked.
No, I mean, you mentioned the Huawei example before. This is the same as saying no European company can ever store any data. And remember, everything is PII, by the way. A company address, employee email address, or name is PII. It's essentially that little piece of law or judgment says that you cannot store any kind of that data on an American computer service. That would be like saying, no.
Fine. So
Yeah,
Martin,
I mean, that's insane, essentially. I mean, it's
Martin
straight up
Christian
insane.
is really unhappy with Schrems 2. He's not the only person who's unhappy with Schrems 2. A number of people are. By the way, this is still being litigated, so we're not seeing the absolute last of it. We'll see where that goes. But Schrems 2 is not really the question, the core right now of the regulation. As a matter of fact, what the regulations are in Europe are regulations about limiting the power of gatekeepers, i.e. very big firms, in the Digital Markets Act. And in the Digital Service Act, it basically says you have some responsibility in terms of the content, and you can't cop out the way that Facebook and Google have copped out so far. And there's a bunch of responsibilities that you have.
So tell me how Facebook and Google suffered from GDPR. They did not. The only ones who suffered was European startups.
Okay.
And the point here is, right, it was so clearly targeted at American tech companies. They're the only one who have the resources to actually do the compliance game. And now this is what I mean when this regulation backfires. It's European startups.
Okay. I'll have to correct it. You know, my summer house is next to Viviane Reding's, who pushed GDPR. So I have heard the story from inside. It was driven by entirely different politics. And also, it was not done the way that the current regulations are. So if you want to go to the data, what they do is asymmetric implication, which they did because they knew they screwed up in GDPR. Why? Because GDPR applies the same whether you're big or small. What do we do with gatekeeper structure? With gatekeeper, we say, big guys, you have a very different set of responsibilities. So let me now turn to Martin. So Martin, we have heard a lot of frustration in terms of the implementation of some stuff, some including particular court judgments. I mean, the Schrems 2 is a judgment as opposed to a regulation, needs to be separated. Yeah. On the other hand, what I hear Christian saying is, it's going to end up being a mess because people don't understand technology. What do you think about the fact that we may be starting with good intentions, DSA and DMA may be addressing problems? I still am not sure from Christian whether these problems exist. I still have not heard whether he thinks that the US has it right or whether they should regulate it. I will return as the final question, and fair warning to you, Christian, I'm not going to take any answer about Schrems or any other gripe that you have with Europe or regulators or your aunt or a cat or anything else other than the question that I'm going to ask. Martin, tell me, are we not, as Christian suggests, going to screw up because we don't understand technology and European bureaucrats are flat-footed and they're going to stay behind?
Look, almost by definition, whenever you have a new and fast developing market and the government tries to step in, the regulators step in, they're always a step behind the leading companies in the market. So you will always have unintended consequences. So I'm definitely not arguing with Christian that all the aspects, for example, of GDPRs have been well thought through, and all the unintended consequences have been, kind of kept in mind. Indeed, I think a lot of people would argue that the biggest problem with a lot of the, regulation of existing regulation, tech regulation, is very uneven and unclear implementation of it, right? And so, for example, one issue is that there's not even necessarily clear, interpretation of what some of these rules mean. And because there is not a single European regulator that can actually do that interpretation, then each country with its own in its own regulator is interpreting in their own way, which clearly, and probably Christian would argue this is absurd. This is creating a lot of bureaucracy, a lot of problems, and I agree with that. So, but I think again, this is being addressed now. The fact that, for example, GDPR was not properly implemented. And a lot of the, DSA and there's going to be also new privacy regulation have to do, trying to fix things about GDPR. Now, I think the question here is not, was the actual specific law and all of its provisions, were they all right? But philosophically, was Europe doing the right thing? And I think here it's very difficult to argue that it was doing the wrong thing, if only because much of the world is now going in the same broad, or has gone in the same broad direction.
Martin, I hear you, but in order to be a bit fair to Christian, the question that I asked was not about philosophy. We all agree that we have problem about peace, happiness, and world order, or whatever the pageant triumvirate needs to be. The question here is whether we're going to get it right or we're going to take a difficult problem and make it worse, because as you know, as a former politician, policy as regulation is always about trade-offs, and you risk breaking things as you try to make the excessive. What do you stand for?
And I think the answer here is it's very unclear where we're going to end up. Whether this is actually going to really help to cut back and limit some of the abuses of this big tech, or if it's going to actually enable them, because as Christian said, they are the only one who have the right resources to then implement some of these measures. But I think the dual approach, which is now being used, as you mentioned, that you have one big regulatory push, which is basically directed at any kind of company which is providing a certain type of digital service in Europe. And then there's a second type of legislation, which is specifically, targeting a gatekeeper, i.e. these, very highly quasi-monopolistic or monopolistic companies, and they are being held to a much, much stricter standard. And so I think, if you ask me, I think this is probably going to get much of the job done, whether directly or indirectly. But of course, there will always be problems. But I think this regulatory action is really necessary, because I disagree with Christian that somebody else will come and just disrupt it. And take the digital advertising market. I mean, that is one there. That's astounding when you start to actually look into it in detail. So currently, as we all know, advertising is moving more and more into digital. 10, 15 years ago, it was marginal. Most of the advertising was non-digital. Now, roughly half of it, all the advertising expenditures are on digital, and it's growing. Facebook and Google, two companies, they currently basically own, quote unquote, roughly 2/3 of all the digital advertising market in Europe, i.e. 2/3 of all the digital advertising spent in Europe goes to Google and Facebook. If you add in a couple of these other gatekeepers like Microsoft, basically you get to somewhere to 85% of the European market effectively being owned by a couple of companies. Now, so the effect is that you clearly have this duopoly that is making it very hard for others to compete in this market. Also because it's not just kind of the ultimate, that they provide the space where you can run an ad. They actually now, own increasingly more of the, of the advertising value chains, including the ad tech that's actually enabling some of these, well, most of this advertising. So again, and this is also a good example of where these companies, you could say, well, who cares, where, what pocket the money ends up from the advertisers. But I think what the companies are doing here is that they are kind of rubbing salt into the wound and adding an offense to an injury, I think is the term, if I may, because by doing that, most of the digital advertising, it went to small publishers, independent publishers. This is the source of their income. This is what they live from. So now you have these companies that are not only distorting public discourse and arguably damaging democracy and Twitter, Facebook, hello, YouTube, directly by basically providing kind of uncontrolled outlets to any kind of extremists, but they're actually further damaging democracy and public discourse by effectively now siphoning up all the money that has been the key source of income for the independent media.
So I'll take advantage of Michael being out of the camera to just jump straight into that. I mean, there's so many things here in what you just said, right? I mean, France owns 100% of the rights to produce champagne. It's just your digital advertising case, right? And you talk about damaging democracy, right? Most of the British voters who voted for Brexit, they got their news from Sky and BBC. And in fact, the whole Cambridge report was a giant fiasco, right? I mean, people actually found out that they had either zero or negative effect in everything they did. Yeah, I mean, the whole report essentially said there was nothing to come for. Like it was.
Well, so, who did they report?
I'm just saying that most of the British voters got their news. Most of the British voters got their news from Sky News and from BBC when they formed an opinion on what to vote. So when we talk about damaging democracy, like this is back to the choice I made in the beginning. You always want to discuss big tech in a vacuum because you don't want to contrast it to what's there. And what's there is already very broken, but it's been there for a long time. And again, back to the monopoly discussion, right? I think it's pretty rich that the region where the average, I mean, just took France, Germany, and UK, where the average lifespan of a listed company in top 5 is 100 years, is telling the companies that have been around for 25 years that they're big monopolies and they're playing protective policies. We talk about 100 years in top 5 of stock exchanges in Europe, in the 3 biggest economies. And they say, well, the other guys are being protective. Now, listen, Nokia was the biggest telco in the world, the phone producer in the world 25 years ago. They got out-innovated by Apple. You know what happened when Nokia, they had the biggest market share? They stopped innovating. You know what American companies do when they have the biggest market share? They keep innovating. They're turning up the amount of innovation. And this is, as a European, what really, really worries me. If we prevent European companies, startups, from access to Google Cloud and Amazon Cloud in the future, this is going to be the difference between being able to build a successful tech company or not. And you might say, well, that's monopolistic power. But guess what? They're spending 23 billion a year on top of what they have to build better services than anyone in Europe are. So I just wonder, right? Like, we kind of have 2 paths. We can create a little protected paradise where we decide who can play, and we end up with the French Minitel, which innovated for 4 years, and then they got a state mandate, and then they never did anything again until the internet arrived.
Christian,
Or
okay, let me just ask you, because I keep hearing the same argument, and I think that, again, making a list about the gripes, about concern about Europe is one thing, but the current regulations are not aimed at forestalling what the European technology companies are doing. You're saying that a side effect, if I understand it right, of these regulations are that if what the Europeans are doing, if they implement it, they will bring some of the European firms at a disadvantage. This is the argument, if I hear it right. On the other hand, the question that I asked you, and I still would like a final answer before the hour is out, we'll see whether I get it or not, is whether you think that we should regulate in the US as well. Do you think, are you convinced by what you have heard?
Are you saying that Europe should regulate in the US? I think we have this sovereignty thing with domestic borders and stuff.
No. You will.
I know European Union is trying to regulate in the US.
You can choose not to, but you are not answering the question. The question is, do you think that the Americans should regulate in the way that the European does or not? Is your argument one of comparative loss of advantage if the US doesn't regulate? Do you think that it is right to regulate? Do you think there is too much power in the big tech firms? Or
I think you've got to be very, very careful regulating tech until you understand it. And you know, understanding it plays out in tens of years, not in 7 months, as people saying. So so that's the first thing. Right.
So the current dominance levels of Facebook and Google and Amazon don't concern you. You are okay with them because
Nokia had a similar position. Listen, Nokia had a similar position to Apple 25 years ago, and they're gone. That's how fast it happens. And you were out when I said it, right? It's pretty rich from the region where the average lifespan of a top 5 company on the stock exchange is 100 years, to tell companies who have an average lifespan of 25 that they're being monopolistic and protective.
Okay, Christian. Okay, hold on.
Hold on, but no, I gotta ask a question, right? Do I think that it's bad what is going on? Do I think it's bad what big tech is doing? Do I think they're being gatekeepers? I think they're controlling markets that they created, and I think everybody else have exactly the same tools to create markets.
Paying 21 billion to buy WhatsApp is not you're controlling.
That's real world examples. I mean, why don't you want to hear the examples? Christian, so Facebook, you keep mentioning Facebook.
Hang on.
TikTok absolutely annihilated Facebook in the US on video viewing.
But that is exactly the problem. Whenever you have a company that is going to buy another company with merger, you're able to potentially block it if you think it'll forestall competition.
But TikTok is not selling. They're not selling.
Facebook bought Instagram and WhatsApp for 21 billion without it having even.
That was a great deal. I wish I had done it.
Because it wasn't afraid it's going to be unseated. You think it would be more or less competitive without it? I mean, I think that it would be a rather brave statement to make.
Did you see the news that Telegram? Did you see the news that Telegram just reached 500 million active users and it's been exploded in usage since Facebook announced that they were going to data share WhatsApp data with Facebook?
Wonderful.
So they're now taking over from an activity perspective from Facebook Messenger.
So let me, okay, this is now turning into a debate between Michael and Christian, so I need to step in. So I mean, first of all, you know, Christian, you have several times used as an example Nokia, you know, as this sort of, you know, like a laggard who got out competed. But mind you, Nokia was not a digital company. Nokia was a hardware, old-style device hardware company.
So is Apple. So was Apple.
Yeah, but
Apple has always been a hardware company.
But nobody's arguing, you know, about their hardware business. The whole argument is that when it comes to digital services, they have now become, you know, they have basically now unfairly created a monopoly and have
What's
used.
unfair about it? I'm sorry. You use these words, but what does it mean? How have they unfairly created a monopoly? They have made amazingly beautiful phones that everybody want to buy, that has an app store on them.
Why? And I'm screaming.
Let me just, the answer is fairly straightforward. Just go ahead and read the rationale of the case that exists right now in terms of the App Store as one example of why they say you will either stick with the 30% and we're not ever going to allow you to even work with us if you try to take payments, which many people say are seigniorage. If it
But
is,
have you tried to sell stuff? Have you tried to walk in from the street and try to sell stuff in a Tesco? See what happens.
was that?
Have you tried to walk in from the street and sell stuff in a Tesco? It's the same.
Tesco, if I buy a DVD from Tesco does not charge for the DVDs that I buy from elsewhere because I had bought the DVD in Tesco itself. That's the difference, and that's a very big difference.
Yeah, I think we already went through this, Christian. The Tesco,
ladies and gentlemen,
retail market. Sorry, Tesco works in retail, and retail is a competitive market, and these app stores, you know, mobile operating systems are not a competitive market. They are effectively a duopoly.
And 30 seconds to wrap up your arguments, Christian.
My argument is that most regulation is backfiring and bad, and we have very little understanding of what we're doing when we're trying to create this regulation.
Right. Well, I'm afraid that we return back to a theological start point. People believe or don't believe in things like regulation. We try to infuse some specific structure to that. I heard some data I had never heard before, like Amazon usage went down. My data, so they don't. I will ask Christian to share us all what the source is. People were asking. I'd like to see them too. I love being educated from that. Lots of facts, lots of views, and hopefully some entertainment with a bit of ridiculousness from the chair. So with that, thank you very much. And let me pass back to our gracious hosts. Thank you for putting up with the repeated beating, Martin, and particular Christian. So thank you very much. And back to you for a united Europe view.
Thank you very much, Professor Jacobides. Thank you very much, Christian Lanng and Martin Bruncko, for what the audience has the majority of the audience has agreed was a very engaging debate. I don't think we've come to definitive conclusions, and we won't find the answer or the holy grail. But thank you really for your time. I said before, United is a non-profit association in the business of promoting the diversity, unity and competitiveness of Europe, and this debate will have helped us in that goal. Anyone who'd like to join and support us, the link is in the chat scene there. As I said at the start of tonight's event, we started punctually, we're finishing punctually. So enjoy the rest of your evening, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, Christian, for a great debate, and thank you, Michael.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you.
Everyone.
Thank you, organizer.
Thanks.
Cheers. Bye.